All right, so let's take a look at some cardiovascular and pulmonary anatomy here. So to start off with, this is the patient's right. This is the patient's left. This, of course, is the heart. And we've got the right atrium, which then pumps down to the right ventricle, which then pumps out through the pulmonary arteries to the left lung and to the right lung. We've got pulmonary capillaries that we'll go over in a few moments, back through the pulmonary veins on the right, pulmonary veins on the left, into the left atrium, which then pumps down to the left ventricle, which then pumps out through the aorta. So there's the aortic arch, three branches of the aorta, dives down, goes inferiorly, and it is the thoracic aorta in this region until it crosses over the diaphragm, then becomes the abdominal aorta. And we've got split here, so iliac artery, femoral artery, on and on and on. And we end up down here going into arterioles. Here's a capillary, smallest blood vessel of the body. And here we have a somatic cell, otherwise known as a body cell. Well, nucleus, mitochondria. And after the capillary, turns into a venule, which is a smaller version it's a small version, just like the arterioles are a small version of an artery. And in the venule, gets larger and larger, turns into a vein. And then we've got for example, the right femoral vein, right iliac vein coming up. This would be the inferior vena cava, which dumps into the right atrium, as well as up here, we've got blood returning from the trunk, from the head rather, and the arms through the superior vena cava, again dumping into the right atrium, and in the whole cycle, right atrium pumps the right ventricle, and it starts the whole cycle. Okay, so let's start off with the blood flow. And we're going to take a look at oxygenated blood that's in the left atrium. So this oxygenated blood is going to get pumped down into the left ventricle and then pumped out through the aorta. So we're going to put red, red, red out through the three branches of the aorta. In this direction here. This is oxygenated blood. And that oxygenated blood is going to come down here into the capillaries. This is, by the way, not the scale, obviously. Capillaries, reminder, are lined with simple squamous epithelial cells. Simple, that's one layer, squamous because they're thin and wide, and that makes it perfect for gas exchange. So because we have a higher concentration of oxygen in a capillary compared to inside the cell, got a little bit of oxygen in the cell, but not a whole ton, the oxygen will then diffuse into the cell. Now, something else that also we need to get into the cell is glucose. So I'm going to put a little glucose right here. And this glucose will enter the cell through facilitated diffusion. So now we've got glucose and oxygen entering the cell, and this little guy here is the mitochondria. And the mitochondria is then going to take the energy that's located in the glucose bond C6H12O6 to the C6H12O6, as well as the oxygen, and recombine those, take them apart, recombine them, and it's going to produce three products: ATP, about 36 ATP molecules. It's a high energy molecule. and it's going to produce H2O and CO2. And CO2 is going to build up inside the cell. And because there's more CO2 inside the cell than there is outside the capillary, there's a high concentration gradient. CO2 will diffuse out of the cell through the simple squamous cells into the capillary and now be on its way back to the heart. Now let's pause here for a second and go over here to the side. It's important that we understand this process here of oxygen and glucose entering the cell and what happens to it. So here we have a process called cellular respiration. And in essence, cellular respiration takes glucose, C6H12O6, and in the presence of oxygen, produces carbon dioxide and water and ATP. ATP is the reason that we do cellular respiration. We want to get as much energy out of glucose as possible. So this is all fine and dandy, but here's the problem. CO2 and H2O. CO2 combines with water very easily to form H2CO3, otherwise known as carbonic acid, which easily, it's a weak acid, which easily disassociates to form HCO3 minus, which is bicarb, and this unknown substance. Well, we know what the substance is, it's not really unknown. You balance the equations out, two hydrogens, one carbon, three oxygens, overall neutral charge. If we have a negative here, it's got to be positive. So that means that we're producing these guys here, otherwise known as a hydrogen ion, hydrogen cation, or proton. They're all synonymous. Now, remember from chemistry, if you have an increase in your proton concentration, this means you have a drop in pH. If you remember, pH goes from 0 to 14. 0 are pure acids. 14 are pure bases. This means all you have over here is H plus. This means all you have over here is OH minus. Okay? In the middle, we've got 7. It's a mixture. It's an equal mixture of H pluses and OH minuses. So if you do H plus OH minus, you have two H's, an O, a positive and negative, that combines to form H2O. So H2O has a pH of 7. Water is neutral. Now, where we want to be, arterial gas-wise, arterial pH-wise, it's right about here, 7.35 to 7.45. There are no units for pH, as a reminder. This is where we want to be, our arterial pH. So what happens, we need to get rid of this CO2. If we don't get rid of the CO2, it's going to combine and we're going to drop our pH. And when you drop pH, this is bad because enzymes denature. That means they stop working. They untangle permanently. It's kind of like denaturing an egg. You can't uncook an egg. So our goal is to maintain a stable pH. While we do that, one of the ways we do that is by getting rid of CO2. How do we do that? We transport it back to the lungs and we exhale it. All right, so now we got CO2 and we're headed back to the heart. These blue dots represent CO2. By the way, this is a break in the blood vessel, inferior vena cava, okay? Same deal. CO2 is coming from your right arm, left arm, down to superior vena cava, and it's going to end up in the right atrium. Okay, so that's CO2 rich blood in the right atrium. Now, the right atrium is going to pump down to the right ventricle. So we're going to have CO2 there. And now the right ventricle is going to pump out through the pulmonary artery to both the right and the left lungs. That goes to the right lung, that goes to the left. So CO2, got a lot of CO2, CO2, same thing over here. A lot of CO2, CO2, and it's headed towards each of these lungs. Now, the CO2 is going to diffuse out of the lungs, diffuse out of the bloodstream, because remember, these are pulmonary arteries turning into pulmonary arterioles. These are pulmonary capillaries, the smallest blood vessels in the lungs. And we'll zoom in over here on the other side of the board. So CO2 is then going to diffuse out. And out right lung and left lung. So CO2 is a higher concentration of CO2 inside the blood vessels than there are inside the lung. So we're going to diffuse out, and we're going to get rid of that CO2 by exhaling. All right, so let's take a look at that actually. Let's come over here. There we go. So over here we've got the trachea, right and left main stem bronchi. Because remember, this is the patient's right, this is the patient's left. So trachea, right bronchus, left bronchus, bronchioles, and we've got these single-celled air sacs called alveoli. So there are alveoli here, they're terminal ending of our small airways. And this one I really blew up, just as the capillaries over here are made of simple squamous cells, so are the pulmonary capillaries and the alveoli, simple squamous. So that means that it's really, really well, a good structure for diffusion of gases. So let's take that CO2. We're simply zooming in. All that CO2, 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 can now easily diffuse out of the pulmonary vasculature and into the alveoli. So now we have CO2 here, and we can now exhale that CO2 out the trachea. Okay, now we take a deep breath in, we're going to take in oxygen. Here's oxygen. Down the trachea. Well, first of all, in your nose, in your nasal cavity, oral cavity, past the epiglottis, through the glottis between the vocal cords, through your larynx, down the trachea, and now we can go down both lungs, well, hopefully both lungs. Now we have oxygen. We've got a high concentration of oxygen, O2, 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 lots of oxygen. Higher concentration of oxygen in the alveoli than in the pulmonary capillaries. So the oxygen is going to diffuse out, down its concentration gradient, going from high concentration to low concentration. Now we've got O2 headed this way back to the heart. And that brings us to, let's go back here. Okay, so now we're picking up oxygen. Heads back to the heart through the pulmonary veins, because remember, all veins go towards the heart, all arteries go away from the heart. Doesn't matter if it is deoxygenated blood or oxygenated blood, arteries go away from the heart. So same deal over here in this lung. Took a deep breath in, high concentration of O2 inside the lung tissue, diffuses in, ruh-roh, ruh-roh. Okay, little mistake here, wrong. Pulmonary vein goes behind the heart here and connects, dumps into the right atrium. So we're just going to go do. I'm sorry, left atrium. Jeez. So these guys, these pulmonary veins dump, this one goes behind, dumps into the left atrium. Left atrium, again, we start back from where we started. Takes out oxygenated blood, pumps to the left ventricle takes out oxygenated blood, pumps it out through the aorta. And that is what we call the pulmonary circuit here. This is what we call the systemic circuit here. So the pulmonary circuit consists of the right atrium and right ventricle pumping to the lungs, and then the blood returning from the lungs coming back to the left atrium. That's the pulmonary circuit. The systemic circulation or systemic circuit is the left atrium pumping to the left ventricle, pumping blood out through the aorta, gas exchange and nutrient exchange distally, and coming back through the venous system back to the right side of the heart, specifically the right atrium.